I'm going to tell you about the morning of Saturday, November 17th, 2023, the day I stood in my small kitchen, holding a cup of coffee I hadn't yet taken a sip of, and watched my son, Gregory, bending over the large green trash bin in the yard. His arms were wrapped around a thick stack of paper, so thick he had to hold it with both arms, leaning back slightly to keep his balance. I saw the yellowed color of those pages, and my heart dropped like a stone. It was my manuscript. The manuscript I had spent 11 years writing. 480 pages, handwritten on sheets of paper that had followed me from the days when my ink was still bold to the years when it faded with time. I recognized every page the way one recognizes a loved one's face. The page with the butterfly-shaped coffee stain in the corner of page 23, and the one wrinkled by rain that blew in through the window on a January night in 2019. The one I had folded and unfolded so many times, the crease had nearly torn. Gregory dropped the stack into the trash, not gently, hard. The dull thud of paper hitting the bottom of the plastic bin cracked through the quiet morning like a small gunshot. Then he brushed his hands together as if he had just finished cleaning up garbage and turned back toward the house. He saw me standing in the kitchen doorway, didn't blink, didn't look embarrassed. Gregory, my son, whom I gave birth to at 2 a.m. on a winter night in 1982, whom I read to every night before bed from the time he was 2 until he was 9 because he said he couldn't sleep without my voice, looked at me and said, "Mom, I told you already. Stop chasing unrealistic dreams at your age. That pile of paper just takes up space. This house needs to be cleaned, and you need to focus on your health, not sit there writing all the time. Who's going to buy a book written by a 68-year-old woman?" I stood still holding the coffee that had now gone cold. Too old. A 68-year-old woman. Who would buy it? I looked past him, through the glass, at the green trash bin. The yellow pages were sticking out over the edge, 11 years of my life, rising from the trash like something trying to breathe. "All right," I said. My voice was so calm, I barely recognized it myself. "Thank you for looking out for me." Gregory nodded, satisfied, and walked into his office. The door closed behind him. I set the coffee down, walked outside. I picked up each page from the trash, smoothed out the wrinkled ones, wiped the damp ones dry with the edge of my sleeve, and carried them back inside. I held the manuscript to my chest, standing in the kitchen, and for the first time in years, I let myself cry without trying to stop. Not because it hurt, but because I had just realized something important. I had been wrong to believe that time and patience would make things work themselves out. Some things do not fix themselves. Some things require you to stand up and do them yourself. And I, Adele Margaret Hartwell, former senior editor at Meridian Press, a woman who had spent 35 years bringing other people's books into the light, decided it was time to do that for my own. My name is Adele Margaret Hartwell. I was born on March 4th, 1955, in Boston, Massachusetts, into a family where books outnumbered furniture. My father taught classical literature at Brookline High School. My mother was a librarian at the county public library. In the house where I grew up, arguments weren't about money or relationships. They were about which Dickens character was the most tragic, or whether Jane Austen was a feminist writer before the term even existed. I was surrounded by words from the moment I could remember, and I loved them not in some abstract romantic sense, but in the most physical way possible. I loved the smell of old paper, the sound of pages turning in a quiet evening, the feel of fingers tracing along a worn edge. I loved language, the thing humans created to hold what cannot be spoken: pain, love, loss, a hope, and carry it across time to people who have never met. At 23, I graduated with a degree in English literature from Boston University and took a job at Meridian Press, then one of the most respected literary publishers in New England. I started as an editorial assistant, doing work most people don't even realize exists, reading thousands of submitted manuscripts, writing evaluation reports, and recommending which ones deserved closer attention. It was quiet work, invisible work, but to me it was heaven. I spent 35 years at Meridian Press, working my way up, from assistant editor to editor, then senior editor, and eventually head of fiction. In those 35 years, I worked with over 200 authors, edited more than 300 books, and, this is the number I am most proud of, helped bring 14 National Book Award winners into the world and 3 Pulitzer finalists. I didn't write those books, but I saw the potential in rough manuscripts. I sat with authors for hundreds of hours, helping them find the core of their stories, refine it, and make it shine. The editing profession carries a beautiful, quiet paradox. You spend your entire life helping other people's voices become clearer, stronger. You learn to recognize what the real story is and what is merely the surface the author uses to hide it. You learn how to ask the right questions to open doors inside a manuscript that even the writer didn't know existed. You become someone who understands literature more deeply than most. And at the same time, you never quite have the time to sit down and write your own. I married Thomas Hartwell in 1981, an architect, someone who loved books in the way an outsider does, sincerely, passionately, but without obsession. Thomas grounded me in the most literal sense of the word. When I brought manuscripts home to read in the evenings, he never complained. He would simply place a cup of tea beside me and quietly read his own book. When I spoke about my authors with an enthusiasm others might find excessive, he listened, truly listened, not out of politeness, but because he cared. And when I said, "Thomas, I want to write my own book," he didn't ask why or when. He just said, "Then write it. I'll be your first reader." Gregory was born in 1982. We had only one child, not because we didn't want more, but because life sometimes makes decisions beyond our control. Thomas and I poured everything we had into Gregory: love, attention, and books. Our small library in our Boston home always had a corner for children's books, then young adult novels, and later the kinds of books I would place on the shelf and say, "You'll love this when you're ready." Gregory grew up intelligent, practical, and distant from words in a way I never fully understood. He studied economics at MIT, worked in finance on Wall Street, and eventually returned to Boston to start his own investment consulting firm. He became successful by the world's standards: a beautiful house, a good car, a bank account without worry. But between him and me, there was always a small, unbridgeable gap. The gap between someone who sees the world as numbers and someone who sees it as stories. Thomas passed away in September 2015 from pancreatic cancer, a disease that arrives quickly and does not allow for long goodbyes. He was gone 8 months after the diagnosis. During those 8 months, he did something I only fully understood later. He read everything I had written up to that point, 300 unfinished pages, and said to me, "Adele, you have to finish this book, not because it's good, though it is, but because you need it, and the people this story is about need it." After Thomas died, Gregory asked me to sell the Boston house and move in with him and his wife, Claudia, along with their 2 children. I didn't want to, but I agreed. I was in the deepest part of my grief then, and I didn't have the strength to refuse. I brought with me the things that mattered most: my books, my papers, and the unfinished manuscript. And I thought I would continue writing in the small room Gregory prepared for me. I thought life would give me more time. I did not expect that in my own son's house I would slowly become invisible. Before I continue the story about Gregory and Claudia and the house in Boston, I need to tell you about that manuscript, about what truly lay inside those 480 yellowed pages my son threw into the trash. It was not a novel, not entirely. It was a memoir, but not the usual kind about the life of an editor. It was the story of the Whitmore family, the most powerful dynasty in Massachusetts for over 60 years, a name tied to politics, philanthropy, and media across New England, and the secrets I had by accident become the keeper of since 1985. That year, I was 30, still early in my editorial career, at Meridian Press. A manuscript arrived at my desk by mail, not through an agent, not through any official channel, but directly from an address I did not recognize. The author signed only A. Whitmore. It was about 200 pages typed on aging paper with no title, just a handwritten note at the top of the first page. Please read, please keep, and please believe. I read it in one sitting. I made tea, sat down, and did not look away until I reached the last page. It was the account of a woman who had spent 30 years as the personal secretary to Harrington Whitmore, the patriarch of the Whitmore family, the man who built the Whitmore Media Group empire in the 1960s. The story was not written as a blunt accusation. It carried the calm, careful tone of someone who had thought long and hard before deciding to put it all down in words. And it contained details about a secret agreement Harrington Whitmore had signed with a foreign corporation to sell reader data, personal information of millions of Americans, back in the 1980s, long before any data protection laws existed. The hidden birth of an illegitimate child between Harrington Whitmore and a Latina woman, a child who was forced away and never acknowledged, and the way the Whitmore family had lobbied to quietly kill 2 press privacy protection bills in the 1990s, decisions that affected millions of Americans, yet were never made public. I understood immediately why the sender had chosen me instead of going through the usual channels. If published, this would be one of the most explosive books of the decade, and one of the most dangerous for the author, for the publisher, and for anyone involved. The next day, I arranged to meet the woman who had sent the manuscript. Her name was Agnes Lim. She was 62 at the time, retired, living alone in a small apartment in Cambridge. She arrived carrying an old canvas bag, with the eyes of someone who had learned how to endure. We sat over coffee for 2 hours. She told me about her 30 years working for Harrington Whitmore, about what she had seen, about what she had been told to keep silent. "I sent it to you because I've read about you," Agnes said. "You're the kind of editor who works with real stories, and you have a reputation for integrity." She paused. "But I have to be honest with you. I'm not brave enough to publish this right now. They're still too powerful. I signed a non-disclosure agreement, but I need someone to hold this story, to make sure it doesn't disappear. I'm getting old, and I don't know how much time I have left." So I kept the manuscript. I kept it locked in a cabinet in my office for years, and later brought it home after I retired. And over the 11 years between Thomas's passing and the moment I began writing in earnest, I did what I believed Agnes had hoped for. I placed her story at the heart of a larger memoir, one about my 35 years in publishing, about the books, the authors, and the stories I had witnessed. Interwoven within it, told with as much respect and legal care as I could possibly ensure, was Agnes Lim's account of the Whitmore family. Agnes passed away in 2012, before I could finish the manuscript, before I could tell her I had not forgotten my promise. But before she died, she signed a document prepared by her lawyer, granting me full rights to use her materials and her story in any form of publication I deemed appropriate. It was notarized and carefully preserved. That was the manuscript my son threw into the trash. Not the work of a delusional old woman, but a story that 40 years of history had been waiting to tell. And I, someone who had edited more than 300 books, someone who could recognize the value of a manuscript within the first 10 pages, I knew exactly what this one could do. Gregory is not a bad person. I need to say that first because this story is easy to misunderstand in simple terms. The kind mother, the ungrateful son. But reality is never that simple. Gregory loves me in the way he understands love. I am certain of that. But love without respect is like a check that's been signed without money in the account. Good intentions, but nothing of substance. I moved in with Gregory and Claudia in December 2015, 3 months after Thomas passed away. The house was large, a renovated Victorian in Beacon Hill, 4 floors, 12 rooms, and Gregory gave me a room on the 3rd floor overlooking the back garden. It was beautiful, quiet, and lonely in the way a space without a soul can be. I put my books on the shelves, placed my manuscript in the drawer of the small desk by the window, and began learning how to exist in a house that was no longer mine. Claudia, Gregory's wife, was the kind of woman you'd see in glossy lifestyle magazines, a home so immaculate it almost felt sterile, meals planned down to the day, relationships managed with the efficiency of a project manager. She wasn't unkind to me. She was simply practical. I was a variable in the equation of that household, handled with politeness, scheduled family dinners, and timely inquiries about my health. In the early years, I maintained my own rhythm. Mornings, I wrote from 7 to 11. Afternoons, I read or walked through Beacon Hill. Evenings, I ate with the family, then returned to my room. Progress was slow but steady. 10 pages, then 20, then another chapter. Some nights, after finishing a section, I would sit and reread it, and thinking of Thomas, remembering his voice reading my words aloud, remembering the way he would nod and say, "This part is beautiful, Adele. Keep going." On those nights, I felt both sorrow and gratitude. Sorrow because he was gone. Gratitude because the story we had begun together was still being written. In 2020, the pandemic arrived, and Gregory's entire household was confined indoors for months. That was when the tensions began to surface. Gregory worked from home, meetings from morning to night, his voice carrying through the house with the strained edge common to people in finance. Claudia managed 2 children in online school, cooked 3 meals a day, and coordinated everything with tight control that began to crack at the edges. And I sat on the 3rd floor, and I wrote. I don't know exactly when the change began, but I noticed it in small details. One day, Claudia asked if I could give up the 3rd floor room so it could be turned into a study for the kids, because the 3rd floor has better light. I said no, and that no created a brief silence whose weight I could feel. Another day, Gregory reminded me not to take over the kitchen too long in the mornings, because he needed the space to work, while I was only having coffee and reading. Small things, taken individually, insignificant, but accumulated over the years, they created a kind of unnamed pressure. In 2021, Gregory began talking about my manuscript. The first time was a casual question. Are you still writing? What are you planning to do with it? I said I was approaching the ending and wanted to send it to some publishers. He nodded, but there was something in his eyes I didn't like. The look of someone assessing the likelihood of failure and finding the odds low. In 2022, he asked more directly, are you being realistic? Do you know how tough publishing is now? People don't buy memoirs from people who don't have a name on social media. I explained that I had a reputation in the industry, that this book had a unique angle. He listened without really listening, the kind of listening you do out of politeness, not understanding. Then in 2023, Claudia suggested clearing out and renovating the 3rd floor room into a gym, because the whole family needs a space to exercise. I said I still needed that room to write. Claudia nodded and didn't ask again. But I knew the matter wasn't over. And I knew because I had lived long enough and read enough of other people's stories to recognize the signs of patience running out. On the morning of November 17th, 2023, that patience ran out, and my manuscript was thrown into the trash. I stood in the kitchen, holding the stack of pages I had just retrieved from the trash, and looked at my son's face, the face I had known from the moment he was born, the face I had read to every night. And I thought, this is not about me and Gregory. This is about a question I had answered wrong for many years, the question of patience and its limits. I was wrong to think that silence was compassion. Sometimes silence is only avoidance. On the afternoon of November 17th, 2023, while Gregory was in a meeting and Claudia had taken the grandchildren to their music lessons, I sat down at the small desk in my room, opened my laptop, and began typing emails. The first email was to Caroline Zhao, CEO of Prisma Literary Agency in New York, someone I had worked with for more than 15 years when I was at Meridian Press. Caroline is one of the top literary agents in the U.S., the kind of person whose email can make any editor at any major publishing house pay attention. We hadn't kept in regular contact after I retired, but I had known her long enough to be sure she would remember me, and I knew her well enough professionally to know that when I said, "I have a manuscript you need to read," she would read it. I wrote a short email, not because I didn't have much to say, but because I had edited enough to understand that fewer, well-placed words are worth more than excess. I told Carolyn I have a completed memoir, 480 pages, combining 35 years in the publishing industry, with primary materials about the Whitmore family and previously undisclosed events related to the history of American media over the past 40 years. I said I had legal authorization from the original source materials, and I asked, "Would you like to read it?" Caroline replied within 4 hours, "Adele, my God, send it immediately." But before sending the manuscript to Caroline, I needed to do several things I had postponed for too long. First was finding a lawyer. I called Margaret Osei, a copyright and publishing attorney I had known during my years at Meridian Press. Margaret listened as I described the situation, including the details about Agnes Lim's manuscript and the authorization document, and said, "Adele, you're holding something many major publishers would be willing to pay a great deal for exclusive rights to publish. But we need to make sure everything is legally sound before anyone reads a single page." We worked for 3 weeks to finalize the legal file, verifying the validity of the authorization document from Agnes Lim, rechecking all factual claims in the manuscript against verifiable source materials, and consulting a public figure law specialist to assess litigation risks. The result of those 3 weeks, we had a solid legal foundation. Not without risk. With a story involving the Whitmore family, risk is always present. But it was manageable risk with the right legal team. And while waiting for Margaret to complete the legal work, I continued living normally in Gregory's house, having breakfast with the family, picking up the grandchildren from school when Claudia was busy, talking with Gregory about the weather, sports news, and neutral topics that wouldn't lead to disagreement. Gregory didn't ask about the manuscript. Perhaps he thought throwing it in the trash had settled the matter. He didn't know that every night after the family went to bed, I sat at my desk, typing emails to Carolyn and Margaret, and finishing the final chapters of the manuscript. I wrote faster than I had at any point in the past 11 years, not because I was in a hurry, but because I was clear. There are moments when clarity comes to you like light after a long rain, not from happiness or anger, but from a deeper kind of calm, and the calm of someone who understands what they want to do and why. In January 2024, the completed manuscript was sent to Caroline Zhao. 492 pages after the final edit, accompanied by a full legal dossier and a cover letter, I had rewritten 12 times before I was satisfied. Carolyn called me 2 days after receiving it. "Adele," she said, and I heard in her voice something I recognized from 35 years in the business, the tone of someone who has just finished reading something important. "I read all night. I need to ask you one question. Are you ready for what's about to happen?" "I've been ready for 40 years, I said. Caroline was silent for a second. Then she laughed. Not a polite laugh, but a real one. "All right, I'll start reaching out to publishers on Monday." That Monday, Caroline Zhao sent the manuscript summary and 15 sample pages simultaneously to 12 of the largest publishing houses in the United States. She called it a preempt auction, a strategy used when an agent wants to create competitive pressure from the outset instead of submitting sequentially. By Wednesday, 7 of the 12 publishers had requested the full manuscript. By Friday, 3 had submitted preliminary offers, And by that Friday evening, while I was having dinner with Gregory's family and listening to him talk about some business deal, my phone vibrated. I glanced at the screen. Carolyn. I excused myself, stepped into the hallway, and answered. Adele, Carolyn said. Harrington Press just offered $135,000 for U.S. first publication rights. Penguin Random House offered $180,000, and Simon & Schuster offered $220,000, plus a profit-sharing deal if the book becomes a bestseller. I stood in the hallway of my son's house, phone in hand, and felt something I have no better word for than recognition, not triumph, not the satisfaction of revenge, but the feeling of seeing something you've long known to be true, finally confirmed by the outside world. There's more, Carolyn said. I got a call from Panoramic Pictures. They read the summary and want to discuss film adaptation rights. The preliminary figure they mentioned is $750,000. $750,000 for adaptation rights. I sat down on the hallway floor, not because my legs gave out, but because I simply needed to sit for a moment. Carolyn, I said, and which publisher do we choose? I think Simon & Schuster, she replied. They have the strongest nonfiction marketing team, and with a story like this, marketing determines everything. I nodded, though she couldn't see me. All right, Simon & Schuster. And Panoramic Pictures, do you want me to arrange a meeting? Yes, I said. Arrange it. I hung up, sat in the hallway for a few more minutes, listened to Gregory, Claudia, and the children talking in the dining room, the clinking of dishes, the laughter of kids, the faint sound of a television somewhere in the background, the sounds of ordinary life continuing, unaware of what had just happened in the span of a 3-minute phone call. I stood, smoothed my dress, and walked back into the dining room. Gregory looked up. Mom, are you okay? Who was that? An old friend, I said, sitting down, picking up my chopsticks. Nothing important. Let's keep eating. That night I slept better than I had in years. The book, titled The Silent Archive, Ko Lu Tru Im Lang, was published by Simon & Schuster on September 15th, 2024. The cover was black with white lettering. I suggested that design, and the marketing team agreed after seeing that other versions weren't strong enough. 2 weeks before publication, Simon & Schuster sent advance copies to a select group of critics and journalists. I didn't know how the response would be. No one ever does. That's the truth about publishing I learned over 35 years. No one really knows where a book will go until it enters the world. The first review appeared in The Atlantic 10 days before release. The reviewer, a literary critic I had read and respected for years, called the book the most important document on American media history in the 21st century, and said that Hartwell writes with the composure of someone who has witnessed and patiently preserved the truth for 40 years. The review was shared thousands of times within 24 hours. Then came the New York Times Book Review, then the Washington Post, then NPR. Each review triggered a new wave of pre-orders. By publication day, the first print run had sold out before the book even reached readers. I sat in the third-floor room of Gregory's house, the room Claudia had wanted to turn into a gym, and read messages and emails from readers, journalists, and strangers I had never met, thanking me for telling this story. And there was an email from Agnes Lim's daughter, the woman I had contacted before publication and met twice to ensure her mother's story was told properly and respectfully. She wrote, "Mrs. Hartwell, my mother was right to trust you. Thank you." I read that email 3 times, then saved it in a separate folder and never deleted it. On the day of publication, something happened that I hadn't entirely anticipated, though logically I could have. The Whitmore family, the family discussed in the book, sent a legal warning letter to Simon & Schuster. My attorney, Margaret Osei, received it and responded the same day with a 70-page legal document detailing the evidence and legal basis for every claim in the book. The Whitmore legal team went silent after that, and a public lawsuit would only bring more attention to the book, something they did not want. By the 3rd week after publication, the silent archive appeared on the New York Times bestseller list at number 4 in nonfiction. By week 4, it rose to number 2. By week 6, it reached number 1. And Panoramic Pictures, after seeing the book climb the charts, increased their offer for adaptation rights to $1,200,000. Caroline called me one November morning and read the number over the phone. I was sitting at the kitchen table in Gregory's house. Claudia was nearby making morning coffee. She heard the number and set her cup down. I looked at Claudia. Claudia looked back at me. In those 2 seconds of silence, without a word spoken, we both understood that many things had changed. Gregory walked into the kitchen just then, looked at his wife and his mother, and asked, "What's going on?" I looked at my son, the child I gave birth to at 2 a.m. in the winter of 1982, the child I read to every night, the child who threw my manuscript into the trash and told me, "Don't indulge in unrealistic dreams at your age." "Nothing," I said. "Just a call from an old friend. Eat your breakfast." And I continued drinking my morning coffee. In February 2025, I moved out of Gregory's house. Not out of anger, not out of revenge. I moved out because I was ready financially, ready emotionally, and ready in the way Thomas used to mean when he was still alive. Adele, when you feel you have enough, do what you want to do. I had waited for that sense of enough for many years, and now for the first time, I had it. I didn't buy a new house. I didn't rent a luxury apartment. Instead, I did something that surprises most people when they hear it. I put down a deposit to move into Emerson Village, an upscale active adult community designed around the philosophy that aging doesn't mean losing your life. I had researched Emerson Village long before making the decision. It wasn't a nursing home in the usual sense. No antiseptic smell, no silent corridors. It was a living community with its own library, creative studios, shared gardens, and a partnership program with Northeastern University that allowed residents to attend classes if they wished. The people who lived there included retired professors, doctors, artists, writers. They lived actively, and they lived with purpose. I used the money from my publishing contract and adaptation rights to secure the largest studio on the 2nd floor, a space overlooking the garden, large enough for a reading corner, a writing desk, and a comfortable chair by the window. I hired an interior designer to help arrange it, not because I didn't know how, but because I wanted this place to be entirely mine, designed for me, reflecting who I am. The Emerson Village Library had a private room reserved for resident authors, and in March 2025, I asked the management if I could host a reading and discussion of the silent archive there. They agreed. More than 80 residents attended. It was the most enjoyable reading event I had ever been part of, not because it was grand, but because the people in that room listened the way people do when they've lived long enough to understand that real stories matter. Gregory called me during the first week after I moved out. He asked if I was okay, if I needed anything, and there was something in his voice I recognized as awkwardness, the kind that comes from someone who doesn't quite know how to handle a situation they misunderstood from the beginning. I told him I was fine, that I was happy, that he could visit any time. I would always be glad to see my son. I didn't mention that November morning, or the trash, or the words, "Don't indulge in unrealistic dreams at your age." Not because I had forgotten, but because I didn't want my story to be defined by its most painful moment. Gregory and Claudia visited me for the first time on an April afternoon. They sat in my studio, the room with books stacked horizontally on low shelves, and afternoon light pouring in through the garden-facing window. And I saw on Claudia's face an expression I had seen many times in my editorial career. The look of someone who has just read a passage and is beginning to understand what the entire book is really about. "This is a nice place, Mom," Gregory said, looking around. There was no longer that tone of control and judgment in his voice, only the simple truth of someone seeing his mother happy. "I know what I need," I said, "and this is it." In May 2025, Panoramic Pictures announced the adaptation of The Silent Archive into a documentary series, 6 episodes, to be released on a major streaming platform. The director they chose was someone I knew and respected, and one condition I requested in the contract, and that was accepted, was that I would serve as a content advisor, ensuring that Agnes Lim's story would be told properly and with the respect it deserved. On the morning I signed that contract, I sat alone in my studio with a cup of tea, and I spoke to Thomas. Not in any mystical or spiritual sense. I don't believe in those things, but in a very simple way. Sometimes you need to say important things to the person who matters most, even if they're no longer here. I said, "Thomas, you told me I had to finish this book. I finished it." This morning, I sat in the chair by the window in my studio at Emerson Village, a cup of tea resting on my lap, looking out at the garden. June in Boston has a particular kind of light, not as harsh as full summer, not as hurried as early spring, but a warm, clear light that feels like something has reached just the right ripeness. I love that light. I am 69 years old. My book is still on the bestseller list in its 38th week. The documentary is in production, and I am writing my second book, not because I want to prove anything to anyone, but because I have a story to tell, and I have the time, and I have a desk by a window overlooking a garden. People often ask me, "How did you feel when your son threw your manuscript in the trash?" That question carries an assumption I want to address directly. They expect to hear about anger, humiliation, pain. They want a story with a clear villain, but that isn't the real story. The real story is what happened afterward. I stood in the kitchen, holding the stack of pages I had just taken from the trash, and instead of sinking into pain, I chose to act. The real story is that moment when you realize the difference between explaining why something cannot happen and making it happen. I spent 35 years helping other people's voices be heard. I know better than most that every story deserves to be told in its own time, in its own way. And the irony is that I, the editor of other people's stories, spent many years believing that my own story did not deserve the same. And this is what I want to say to you, not as advice, because I dislike one-way advice, but as something I have learned from a lifetime with words and with people. No story is meaningless just because its teller is old. No manuscript expires just because it has sat in a drawer too long. No dream is unrealistic just because someone else cannot see its value, especially when that someone is not the one who spent a lifetime building it. Age is not a measure of how close you are to death. Age is the thickness of experience, and experience, when used properly, is not a burden. It is a resource. 35 years of editing gave me this. I can recognize a good story from the first page. I can see the core of a story even when it is buried beneath layers of roughness, yet to be polished. I know the difference between a story that wants to be told and a story that needs to be told. The Silent Archive is a story that needed to be told. Not my story. The story of Agnes Lim, of workers affected by hidden agreements, of a child given away without a choice. I was only the one who held it long enough and carefully enough to tell it at the right time. Gregory called me last week. We talked for about half an hour about ordinary things, the grandchildren, city news, the small details of everyday life. Before hanging up, he said something I think he had been thinking about for a long time. "Mom, I'm sorry about that morning. I was wrong. I didn't say it's okay because it wouldn't have been true. And I didn't say yes. You were very wrong, because that wasn't something I wanted to carry either." I said, "Thank you, Gregory. That means a lot to me." And I truly was grateful. Not because an apology fixes everything. Some things cannot be fixed, and that is a truth adults must accept. But because that apology is proof that he is learning, that he is becoming the man I know he can be. That, too, is a story about change that can happen when someone is brave enough to admit they were wrong. And that story, that one I keep to myself. I don't write it down. I don't publish it. It is mine alone. This morning, sunlight falls through the window, forming squares of light across my floor. The tea has gone cold because I forgot to drink it while thinking about this story. My notebook lies on the desk. I still draft my first versions by hand. And I will never change that habit. It's blank pages waiting. I set the cup down, pick up my pen, and I begin to write. Because this is what I have learned from all the books, all the authors, all the manuscripts I have read, edited, and brought into the light over 35 years of my life. A story does not end when you run out of pages. A story ends when you put down your pen and decide not to write anymore. And I have not put my pen down. I won't be putting it down for a very long time.